That night, he smirked, not at her, at the pouch of silver. 3 horses, a sack of dried meat, and the girl. Virgil Langley, her father, tipped back the bottle and drank deep, then wiped his mouth on his sleeve like a man sealing a shrewd deal. His voice dropped low, but it struck her back like a slap. She's no good for anything, eats too much, talks too little. No man ever wanted her, so I figured 3 good horses was a fair trade. No one replied. No one objected. Even the wind seemed to still around the fire. Silas stepped forward and opened the pouch of coins. He didn't look at Virgil, just counted, calmly, precisely, then held it out. Not slow, not rushed. A gesture quiet but firm. Virgil snatched the pouch, as if afraid the man might change his mind. His fingers clenched around the strap. His eyes flicked to Etta one last time. Not in farewell, not in regret. Just a glance, cold and final. The way someone looks at a worn-out thing they've finally gotten rid of. Like glancing at an old possession one last time, before leaving it behind forever. Etta Mae Langley was born without hope. No one waited for her first cry. Her mother bled out during a 3rd labor, taking an unborn son with her. At 7, Etta became what lingered. Not a life, but a remnant of death. After the funeral, no arms held her. Her father, Virgil Langley, turned his eyes away for 3 long days. When he finally spoke, his words cut like a blade. "Why are you still here?" That day, Etta learned to fade. No tears, no arguments, no questions. She drifted through the Langley ranch like a shadow, doing chores no one asked for, bearing blame no one claimed. Her stepmother, Lorna, a widow with hands rough as bark, called her that girl. Her half-siblings gave her no name at all, but when Lorna's back was turned, they whispered, "Crow face," for her crooked nose, ashen skin, and eyes shadowed like she hadn't slept in a lifetime. Etta never answered. She knew a truth no one taught. If no one wants you, fighting only makes them cast you out faster. The summer she turned 19, the world sealed itself shut. Wheat curled like charred paper. The well coughed up damp sand. Chickens tore at each other's feathers. Virgil surveyed the dying land like a man tallying debts, weighing what still held worth. Etta wasn't a daughter. She was a mark in his ledger, a burden with a shape. On a windless afternoon, he scratched her name from his life with a trade as quiet as dust settling. When the stranger rode up, Etta was mending her stepsister's socks. No one called her name. But the snap of dry kindling under the porch told her everything. The campfire tonight wasn't for supper. It was for bartering. Silas wasn't like any man she'd known. His skin glowed like sun-warmed bronze, a faint scar slicing across his nose like a crack in parched earth. He settled by the flames, silent. No drink poured, no words offered, no glance spared. He sat steady as a rooted stone, untouched by the wind's howl. Virgil spoke as if selling a worn-out mule. "She ain't much to look at. Keeps quiet, though. Don't ask for nothing. Healthy enough. Fair trade for the medicine and 3 horseshoes." Etta wasn't summoned. Her thoughts weren't sought. She only heard her worth measured in her father's gravelly growl. Then came the sound. Leather striking earth. A pouch of silver coins. A bundle of dry grass. A bone-handled knife. A nod. A gruff "done." She rose without command. Not out of obedience, but because she'd grown used to being sent away without farewells. Lorna scrubbed linens, unmoved. The children fought over a bruised apple, and Virgil, the man who once kissed her mother's cheek in the glow of dusk, didn't look back. Silas didn't touch her. He handed her a blanket, rough and plain. and nodded toward the horse waiting outside. She mounted the saddle like stepping into a grave no one would mourn. They left as the sun sank. The evening wind stung her cheek, leaving a burn no eye could see. On the trail, Etta asked nothing. No name, no destination, no reason. Only the steady thud of hooves on dirt, echoing her heartbeat. Soft, fading, barely alive. They stopped in a hollow where a stream whispered low. Silas dismounted, pitched a tent, kindled a fire. Etta stood apart, clutching the blanket, unsure whether to sit or stand. No one told her. No one forbade her. As the embers glowed, she studied him. Not quickly, not in fear, but like someone tracing a painting's hidden lines, searching for meaning in the spaces left unsaid. He didn't look back. He fed the flames, cleaned his blade, wrapped herbs in leaves, hushed. And in that stillness, for the first time, she felt unjudged, unweighed, unnamed, simply there. She sat, 3 steps away. The fire between them, a boundary, or perhaps a pact. He stayed on his side, she on hers, crossing only by invitation. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for once fear didn't grip her. Only a hollow ache, too deep for tears, too still for thoughts. As if she'd died long ago and this was her ghost trailing a stranger's horse. That night, sleep didn't come. Her back ached against the hard earth, but her eyes stayed open. Not from dread, but from waiting. Waiting for a hand to seize her, for hair to be yanked, for a mocking laugh. None came. Only the stream's murmur, and the even breath of the man across the embers. She pulled the blanket tighter and wondered. If he wants nothing from me, then what am I in his eyes? A trade? A burden? Or however faintly, a person? And in that tangle of unspoken questions, tears streamed down her cheeks. Not from pain, not from sorrow, but because for the first time, she wasn't cast out. She wasn't claimed. She was simply allowed to be, as if that alone was enough. The embers glowed between them, not flaring, not fading, just glowing. Etta woke to the scent of burning pine, and a sound so familiar it felt foreign. Running water. Not the wheezing sputter of the Langley ranch pump, but the honest murmur of a creek. Steady, unbroken. She sat up, blanket still wrapped around her, and for a fleeting moment, forgot where she was. Sunlight slanted through the leaves, dancing on the water's surface and her tangled bird's nest hair. A fragile thought stirred within her, too small to breathe fully. I've never woken like this before. Silas crouched by the creek's edge, his sinewed arms washing a strip of venison. No humming, no greeting, just deliberate, grounded movements, as if he belonged to this place. Not arriving from anywhere, not needing to leave. When he turned, their eyes met for the briefest moment. No nod, no smile. But something in his gaze made Etta look away quickly, like a thief catching her reflection in a mirror, unsure if she wanted to see it. It had been years since anyone looked at her like that. Not with pity, not with want, but as if she were real, as if she hadn't vanished beneath the weight of names that were never hers. Silas returned to his task, and Etta, for reasons she couldn't name, began rebuilding the fire. Her hands fumbled, kindling slipping through her fingers. He didn't correct her, didn't help. He just let her try, and watched long enough to make her want to get it right. Not because she had to, but because being allowed to fail and then try again was a luxury she'd never known. After breakfast, rough venison, barely salted, yet tasting like the first meal she'd ever eaten for herself, they moved on. Silas didn't urge the horse forward, didn't look back. He walked as if the trail had always known him, and Etta followed, watching his footprints press into the earth like lines of a wordless language. For 3 days, no words passed between them. But Etta began to see that Silas spoke in other ways. When she stumbled on a riverbank stone, he caught her. Not tightly, not forcefully, just enough to steady her balance. When she lay down unsure which way to face, he gently turned her blanket, then settled on the far side of the embers, never turning his back. And when she woke in the night, startled by a dream of her father's shouts, he handed her a small pouch. Inside were dried herbs and a few kernels of corn. His voice, soft and halting, thick with Comanche, said, "Sleep well." 2 words. They broke her. She turned away, tears soaking her sleeve. She didn't understand why those words, from a man who didn't know her name, could make her heart, long withered, crack like overripe fruit. Perhaps because he didn't ask why she wept, didn't tell her to stop. He just let her. As if sorrow were reasonable, as if it needed no cause. Silas didn't tell stories, didn't speak of family, past, or purpose. He lived as if the day were long enough to hold all that mattered. But from the way people looked at him along the trail, hunters, native women, children in a small village where they stopped for water, Etta knew he wasn't ordinary. They gazed at him with quiet respect, with nods like small rituals. Some wouldn't meet his eyes, as if afraid to face what he carried. Not a weapon, but a stillness heavy with loss. And Etta saw it then. He wasn't silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he knew too much that no one wanted to hear. That afternoon, resting beneath an old cedar, Silas drew a worn wooden comb from his coat pocket. So old its edges had softened to curves. He handed it to her, gently, as if it were sacred. "Mother made," he said, "for my wife." But she never came. As he sat by the firelight, its orange glow flickering across the scar on his nose, a line separating who he'd been from who he was becoming, Etta noticed a small object tucked beneath his collar, a leather cord holding a carved piece of bone etched with a tiny sun. He touched it absently, fingers brushing it like checking a treasure hadn't slipped away. She didn't ask, but his gaze drifted, far off, to a village lost to time, where chimney smoke once rose and a young woman's laughter had long been carried off by the wind. "Lost her to fever," he said, voice rough as stones grinding. "Took her before we could walk together." It was the first time Etta heard him speak of a name no longer living, and she wondered. Perhaps he hadn't traded for her out of pity, but because he saw in her eyes a grief he'd once carried too. She took the comb, fingers trembling. She could feel the shape of that other woman, the one who carved each tooth with the hope it would rest in the hands of a girl her son loved. And now it lay in the hands of a girl bartered like cattle. "Why me?" Etta asked, eyes lowered. Silas looked at her, long, deep, then said, voice low as the earth, "Your eyes held sorrow. I don't turn from sorrow." She didn't recall how tightly she gripped the comb, only that her chest ached, as if someone were gently unraveling each thread within her. Not to wound her, but because even pain, when held gently, could loosen what once felt unbreakable. That night, she combed her hair by the embers. For the first time in years, she didn't tear at it in shame. Didn't yank it as punishment. Each stroke was a whisper. "I'm still here. I can still soften. I can still be seen if someone looks close enough." She didn't think herself beautiful, but that night she no longer saw a monster. And maybe, just maybe, that was the closest thing to a miracle Etta Mae Langley had ever touched. 3 days passed in a silence both beautiful and taut, like a bowstring unpulled but ever ready to snap. Etta grew accustomed to sounds she'd overlooked her whole life: the clatter of stones beneath hooves, the steady breath of Silas as they paused in the open wild, the soft brush of his leather coat against prairie grass when he bent to tighten a rope. She learned not to ask questions, not from fear, but because their silence had its own structure, like an old wooden cabin where every beam bore the weight of things unsaid. One afternoon, as the sun bled red like a healing wound, they stopped beside a low cliff. Silas gestured toward the creek to water the horses, while Etta set to kindling a fire. As she gathered twigs, her hand brushed a fire ant nest. Pain seared, sharp, immediate, jerking her hand back, scattering the fledgling blaze. Silas turned, saw her clutching her hand, eyes stinging. He didn't speak, didn't fuss. He stepped close, took her wrist with a touch light as a leaf, and pulled from his pocket a sprig of pale green weed. Before she could react, he bit down, chewed the leaves to a paste, and smoothed it over her burning skin with a calloused thumb. No words. But in the gentle press of his hand, in the way the dying light caught the angle of his jaw, something cracked open inside her. Not from the pain, not from the remedy, but because for the first time someone saw her wound as something other than her fault. She stilled, her hand in his, eyes fixed on his thumb tracing warmth across her skin. He didn't pull away at once, didn't look up. They stayed there unmoving. The fire flickered behind them. The creek murmured below, and the ants skittered around the tree's roots, as if they too were startled by what they'd stirred. When he let go, Etta didn't say thank you. Not because she didn't know how, but because words, in that moment, felt clumsy, like knocking on a door already held open for you. That night, the embers glowed again, not just to roast meat, not just to warm bones, but to kindle something new, fragile, yet real. Silas drew a rough piece of wood from his pack and began carving with the dagger he always carried. Etta sat across, hands on her knees, watching the blades dance. Not out of curiosity, but because it was how she learned him, through what he did when he had nothing to prove. "Why do you carve?" she asked, the words slipping out, surprising even herself. He paused, just a heartbeat, then resumed, his voice low as the earth. "My hands hold what my tongue forgets." Etta stared at the wood, now taking the shape of a small bird, its back curved, beak sharp, but wings yet unformed. She didn't ask more, but all that night, his words lingered in her mind. Perhaps that was how he loved. Not with words, not with touch, but by etching the world in wood, in blade, in things as quiet as he was. And Etta, who'd never been remembered in any way, realized, if he ever gave her that bird, unfinished as it was, it would be the truest thing she'd ever received. Before sleep, she drew her blanket closer to him, not close enough to touch, but near enough for the firelight to catch her face if her eyes opened. They didn't, but she knew he stayed awake, and the embers between them, for the first time, were no longer a divide. They were a promise, unspoken. On the 10th day of their journey, the air turned cold, though winter was still distant. Not a biting chill, but a sly wind that slipped through collars, creeping into bones. A kind that stirred memories of places left behind, even those you thought you'd forgotten. They'd crossed a stretch of low, rocky land where trees grew sparse when the echo of hooves rose from the ridge. Silas halted, not wary, but with the instinct of a man who'd learned to listen before speaking. 4 men and a woman rode toward them, clad in dark leather, wide-brimmed hats framing smiles that barely hid scorn. Etta knew their kind from her years in town, folks who saw anything unlike them as lesser, anything unyielding as dangerous. The woman, Cora, spotted Etta first, or rather her pale skin, stark against the sun-warmed bronze of the man beside her. "Girl, are you all right?" Her voice rang out, not quite concerned, but as if Etta were a stray cat plucked from a dung heap. Before Etta could answer, a man on horseback cut in, his drawl thick with southern grit. "She's with one of them, ain't she? A girl like that don't belong out here with a savage." The word savage struck like a slap, not new, but painfully familiar. Etta had heard it through childhood, spat in town about native folk like they were wild dogs snapping at livestock in the dark. Cora dismounted, striding forward. Her heavy cloak swayed, her face flushed from the wind, eyes gleaming with a dangerous brightness. Without waiting, she seized Etta's arm. "Sweetheart, don't be scared. We'll get you out of here." Etta froze. Her arm lay limp in Cora's grip. For a fleeting moment, she didn't know what to do. She could say, "I'm fine. I chose to be with him." But her throat tightened, her mind tangled like vines after rain. All the old notions of right and wrong, civilized and heathen, loved and used, surged like a flood. And in that hesitation, she pulled her hand from Silas's, not gripping, not holding, just standing between, choosing neither. Silas said nothing, didn't turn away, but his eyes held hers, not accusing, not sad, just still as a lake after a stone's ripple. Cora kept talking, about parents who might be searching, about laws, about "you're safe now." But her words blurred into noise. Etta looked to Silas, hoping for anger she could apologize for. When she drew her hand from his under Cora's probing gaze, Silas stayed silent, but his grip tightened on the reins, knuckles paling as if holding back a tide within. His eyes didn't flare with rage or blame, only a quiet ache, like a lake stirred but refusing to ripple. Etta wondered if he'd faced such looks before, whispers branding him an outsider, and if he feared, even faintly, that she'd return to the world that cast her out, leaving him alone again with the silence he knew too well. That hurt more than any scolding ever could. Cora still held her, arm tugging gently, blind to the storm within Etta, seeing only a fear to save. Etta stood there, the cold wind biting through her collar, like a sapling pulled back toward roots long rotted. Then she stepped back. 1 step. Enough for Cora's hand to slip free. Etta met the woman's eyes, not harshly, not defiantly, but long enough to speak what words couldn't. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse as if swept away by the wind. "But I'm not the one who needs rescuing." Her words, though soft, carried. One man snorted, another turned his horse, bored with the game. "Suit yourself," one spat. "Don't come crying when he turns on you." Cora faltered, then pulled her cloak tight, her eyes no longer pitying but stung, as if she were the one betrayed. Etta didn't look away, didn't apologize, didn't explain. She stood there, between Silas and the world she'd left, not as a bartered thing, but as someone who knew what she'd chosen. Cora mounted her horse without another word. The group rode off, leaving a trail of red dust. And Etta, for the first time, was left behind, not because she wasn't enough, but because she was enough to need no one else. Silas walked on, neither faster nor slower. He glanced back once, his voice soft as a breeze through his coat. Sometimes you return to where you started, only to see you never belonged there. Etta didn't reply, but her hand tightened in her pocket, where the silver hairpin he'd given her lay cool and steady, a reminder. She hadn't done wrong, but in that moment, she'd let others speak for her. That night, they camped near a mountain pass. No words passed over dinner. The fire burned as it always did, but its warmth felt dimmer. Or perhaps it was her, having turned from the flame that once kept her from the cold within. She sat by a tree, her back against its chilled bark, watching Silas, now turned away, washing his hands in the creek. His shoulders, broad and unyielding, no longer felt like a haven as they had before. Not because he'd changed, but because she'd pushed herself out. No tears fell. She had no strength left to weep. But shame lay quiet beneath her skin, like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Etta drew the silver hairpin from her pocket. She held it tight, feeling the traces of his hands in its carved wood. And for the first time, her thanks came not in words, but in action. She rose, stepped toward the embers, and sat beside him. No apology, no explanation, just presence. Silent as he'd taught her from the start. Sometimes the strongest thing isn't words, but staying when you could so easily vanish. They hadn't gone far before the wind shifted, carrying something heavier than the scent of horse and sweat. Intent. Silas sensed it first. He stopped, eyes tracing the horizon as if the breeze had whispered a warning Etta couldn't hear. Then they appeared, the same group, but gone were the mocking laughs and honeyed offers. Only the glint of a rifle under the sun remained. "Step away from her!" a man barked, voice sharp as a stone flung into still water. "We're taking her back!" Silas didn't move. Neither did Etta. Before a rope could graze his shoulder, Silas stepped forward, hand resting lightly on the dagger at his belt. His gaze swept the group like a wolf sizing up foes. "She stays," he said, voice low but cutting, like a blade through open air. Not a threat, but a line drawn by a man accustomed to facing scorn. Etta's heart pounded, not from fear, but because for the first time she saw him stand not just to shield her, but to declare she was worth choosing. Then it all happened too fast to think. A rider spurred forward. Silas shoved Etta aside, not roughly, but firmly. A horse screamed. The first blow landed, the butt of a rifle cracking against Silas's shoulder. He didn't fight back, only hunched, arm still barring Etta from harm. A second blow struck his leg, forcing him to his knees. Another man leapt down, rope looping around Silas's shoulders, binding him in the dust like a beast unyielding. "Don't touch him!" Etta's cry tore free, but it drowned in the clamor of shouts and stomping boots. A young man, near Etta's age, aimed a trembling rifle at Silas. His eyes held no cruelty, only a raw doubt, forced to pull a trigger before understanding what he opposed. Cora stepped forward again. "This is for your own good, honey," she said, voice soft as if guiding a child from flames. Etta looked at Silas. His face scraped, yet his gaze steady as a windless dusk. No pleading, no shame. Only a quiet pain she'd never seen in another. The ache of being misjudged, with no right to explain. And in that moment, his eyes seeking hers not for rescue, but to be seen truly, something ignited within her. She stepped into the circle of men, stood between Silas, bound, and the crowd convinced of their righteousness. "Stop!" Her voice wasn't loud, but clear. Clear enough to halt the click of a rifle cocking. "He didn't take me," she said, each word piercing her own flesh like an arrow. He's the first who didn't see me as something to discard. Silence stretched. No one stirred. Sunlight slanted across her face, hair matted with sweat, hands trembling but back unbowed. She locked eyes with the young man holding the rifle. "Put it down," she said. Not pleading, not daring, just truth too long held back. And he, the boy who hadn't yet learned the world, lowered his weapon. Another glanced around, saw no one press forward, and reined his horse back. Cora stood frozen, her face pale. Her eyes no longer held pity, but bewilderment, as if her own kindness had been misplaced. Etta knelt beside Silas. Her hands untied the knots at his wrists. Blood seeped, dark against the gray earth, yet his hands didn't shake. When the last rope fell, she didn't say sorry. She didn't need to. By standing there before them all, she'd done what no one taught her, chosen the one she trusted, not the ones she feared, not from duty, not from debt, but because this love didn't need to hide. No shots were fired, no blood was spilled, but an invisible cage within her shattered into 1,000 pieces. Etta rose, facing the group. Her face flushed, wrists scraped, but her eyes no longer looked down. "Leave us," she said. "You don't need to fix what was never broken." No one answered, but they left. One by one, they turned their horses, leaving a trail of dust in the fading light, like a period closing an old chapter of her life. Silas said nothing. He stood, gathered the worn rope, coiling it like a man clearing debris after a storm. Etta watched him, then took his hand, still marked red from the binds. "Next time," she said, voice rough with wind, "they'll have to go through me first." Silas didn't smile, but his eyes, for the first time, flickered with something beyond defense, beyond sorrow, recognition. Not "you belong to me," but "I see you." And in that desolate land, two souls once unchosen had finally chosen each other. They left the valley as dawn broke through the mist. Black crows still perched silently on ancient oaks. No farewells echoed. No hands reached to hold them back. The world below, claiming its civility, had taught Etta many things, but never how to love herself. And now she walked, not as a fugitive, but as one who knew there was nothing left to stay for. The path up the mountain twisted and hushed. No wagon ruts, no footprints, only knee-high grass and wind. Silas led, his tall, quiet frame moving like a stone given life. He didn't ask if she was certain. He didn't need promises. They carried only a few cloth bags, a roll of hide, and 2 small knives. Enough to live, nothing to regret. Their stopping place was unremarkable. A high, flat clearing, 3 sides fringed with pines, a thin creek threading through the camp's edge. No one had named this place, and no one waited for them there. But that first night, as Etta lay listening to the crackle of burning wood and the wind's murmur through the hide roof, she understood. This wasn't a refuge. This was where she'd live, truly, for the first time. Days wove together with small tasks. Silas rebuilt wooden frames, patched the tent with old deer hide. Etta learned to weave baskets from vines, gather sage, plant sprigs of mint by the entrance. Her hands cracked, her back ached, her wrists burned red. Yet she'd never felt so vividly alive. Mornings, she wrote in a rope-bound notebook, "Silverleaf grows near ant nests. Good for bee stings. When crushed, its sharp scent recalls an old dream." No one told her to record these things, but each line was a mark, a quiet proof she existed, not a burden, not a bartered thing traded by men over a fire. One day, washing her hands in the creek, The water mirrored her like glass. A woman stared back, tangled hair, shadowed eyes, sun-darkened cheeks, lips chapped and dry. But strangely, Etta didn't see the ugly crow her father once named her, nor the debt-ridden goods. In that reflection, for the first time, she saw herself, not through scorn or pity, but as a person, present, named, with blood still flowing. A breeze stirred then, light as a hand brushing her hair. It called her name, not in the tongue of towns or laws, but in the way it touched her skin, as if she'd always belonged to this land. She looked up. Silas was carving by the firelight, a bird half-formed, wings outstretched but beak rough, tail unfinished. He didn't meet her eyes, yet seemed to know she'd crossed some deep threshold. That night, they sat close, not touching, but not distant. The flames hummed between them, a guardian spirit. Silas slid the tenderest piece of meat into her bowl. Etta quietly tucked straw behind him when he dozed in the howling night. No one said, "I love you," but every small act spoke it, gentler, truer than words. A stranger came in the 3rd month, a native man from a nearby tribe, trading salt for herbs. When he asked what Etta was to Silas, she didn't hesitate. Looking into his eyes, she said softly, "I'm here because I chose to be." With him, not as a captive, nor a follower. Her words earned a nod, no questions asked, but Etta knew. She'd spoken a truth she once couldn't believe. The mountain winds shifted daily. Some carried the scent of ripe berries, others the damp earth after rain. Yet Etta never found them fearsome. She began to understand. This place didn't cling to her, nor push her away. It only whispered, "If you stay, become part of it." And Etta stayed. Not for anyone, not to prove anything, but because she'd stopped needing permission to live. Spring arrived slowly, like a memory coaxed back to life, like warmth rediscovering a body gone too long cold. It melted the snow not with fury, but with patience. Streams formed underfoot, threading between stones like veins bringing color back to a pale land. Moss returned, soft as forgiveness, covering the scars winter had left behind. Etta spent her mornings by the creek, learning the ways light moved across water and how willow branches wrote in the sky. She had begun to laugh again, quietly, like a secret only the breeze knew. Not every day, not all the time, but enough. Then came the man from town. He didn't belong there. His boots broke branches carelessly. His coat had the smell of iron nails and freight trains. Etta knew, before he spoke, that he'd come to bring something she hadn't asked for. He handed her the letter with calloused fingers, said the name like it still meant something. Virgil Langley. Said typhoid like it was just another chore on a long list of endings. Then tipped his hat and left, as if he hadn't just broken open a chapter she'd tried not to reread. She stood there for a long while after, letter crushed in her hand, not reading it again, not needing to. There was nothing in those inked words she hadn't already buried. That afternoon, she didn't cry. She didn't talk. She simply walked the slope behind the cabin, carrying a handful of wildflowers, purple and jagged and defiant. Flowers her mother once pressed into her palm and whispered, "These are the only ones wild enough to match you." There was a stone there, plain and pale under the same tree that dropped golden leaves in October. She knelt, set the flowers down, then stayed until the light changed, and her knees ached and her breath calmed. No prayers, no stories, just presence. When she returned, the fire had been stirred and coffee was on. Silas was gutting a fish, movement steady, familiar. He didn't speak, just reached behind a pile of hides and handed her a small bundle. Deerskin tied with a knot he'd taught her how to make last summer. Inside was the silver hairpin. She hadn't seen it in months. Thought it had been lost in the snowstorm when their first roof collapsed. It had once been her mother's, then hers, then forgotten like so much else she hadn't known how to carry. But now, polished and weighty, it felt different. Less like a relic, more like a decision. She looked up, met his eyes. He didn't say a word, didn't move toward her. Just watched, and still, everything she needed to know was there. Later that night, she slipped the pin into her hair. Not for show, not to look pretty, but because it belonged there. Because she belonged there. They didn't have a wedding. No preacher rode up the ridge. No rings changed hands. No names were spoken into wind. But the next morning, she found her knife sitting beside his whetstone. Her boots placed next to his under the cot. A second mug carved out of cedar, smoothed on, the inside like it had been whittled with care. Love wasn't declared. It was practiced. In the way Silas learned the names of the plants she taught him, even when his tongue stumbled over syllables. In the way Etta kept 3 extra pairs of moccasins by the door, for him, for the future, for whatever might come. In the way their hands brushed over the same onion bulb in spring planting, and neither pulled back. In the way silence became safe. Not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed saying. One night, weeks after the letter came, a storm rolled through. Loud, cracking, mean. The kind that used to make her heart skitter like a rabbit. She woke, breath tight in her chest. But Silas was already up, setting extra logs by the stove, laying a thick blanket across her feet. He didn't ask what was wrong. Didn't tell her it would be fine. He just sat on the floor beside the cot, leaning back against it like a wall built just for her. She fell asleep to the sound of his breath, slow and steady, like the mountain itself had decided to stay. When the weather cleared, they went back to their rhythm, collecting pine bark, mending the roof, trading hides for salt. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. That evening, while Silas was out checking snares, Etta lit the lamp and opened her notebook. Pages filled with pressed leaves, sketches of bird bones, recipes written in her own shorthand. On the last page, she didn't write about Virgil. She wrote about Silas. Not his name, not his face, but what he'd taught her without ever saying it. That love didn't need permission. That trust wasn't begged for, but earned. That healing didn't always make a sound. And then, with her hand steady and heart quiet, she wrote, "He gave me away, thinking I was nothing. But he doesn't define love. He just lives, as if I'm worthy of it." She capped the ink, blew out the flame, sat in the darkness and waited, not for fear, not for ghosts, but for the sound of his boots returning from the ridge. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, not in warning, not in grief, but as if whispering her name with gentleness. And for the first time in her life, Etta let it carry her forward. Not Etta, the girl bartered, but Etta, the woman chosen and kept. If this story settled in your heart like dust on a windowsill, we'd be mighty grateful if you gave it a like, hit that subscribe button, and maybe left a comment telling us what it made you feel. Here at Wild West Love Echoes, we tell the kind of stories that don't shout. They stay quiet in your chest long after the tale ends. Every word you share helps us carry these echoes a little farther down the trail.